This is the Ford Pinto. I quite like the look of it. It was the product of a challenge made by the higher-ups at Ford in a way to compete with cheaper imported cars. It had to weigh no more than 2,000 pounds and cost no more than $2,000, which is around 15 grand today, so it was a real bargain. It did have one fatal design flaw though. Rear-end collisions, even minor ones, could rupture the Pinto's fuel system, which ended up leading to a ton of exploding cars. In all seriousness, this car's terrible design led to at least 500 burn deaths, and that's just counting people who could have walked away from the crash had it not been for this vulnerability. In short, the petrol tank was about 6 inches ahead of the rear bumper, but that should suffice, right? Especially against a low-speed crash? Well, let's do a quick quiz. What speed of collision was the late model of Pinto able to withstand to its rear? A, 10 miles an hour, B, 15 miles an hour, or C, 20 miles an hour? If you guessed any of the above, you'd be incorrect because the real answer is 5 miles per hour. The worst part about all this? Ford knew about it before they even started producing the car. A group of engineers discovered this huge vulnerability during pre-production tests. Not only was this whole thing potentially avoidable, but Ford actually owned a patent on a considerably safer petrol tank, which they could have easily used instead. The thing is, the production line equipment had already been set up, so it would have been a bit of a faff to sort this out. Some big bods at Ford decided to give the car the go-ahead anyway in order to avoid a minor headache. It turns out, this minor headache they thought they have avoided ended up turning into a lobotomy for Ford. So what did they decide to do after the first couple of explosions? Issue a recall, alter the production, apologise profusely for the deaths and fix their mistakes? Well, no, they lobbied against a safety standard imposed by the government, which would have forced them to change the car and make it safer. They lobbied and lobbied and lobbied some more, and by the time they got bored of all of this lobbying, 8 years had passed. 8. They did all this lobbying because some business analyst people decided that it would make the most financial sense to drag it on for as long as possible, which essentially meant that Ford had worked out how much it would cost them to let people die. In 1977, Mark Dowey wrote an investigative journalism piece for Mother Jones on the topic, titled Pinto Madness. Thanks to the research he did decades ago, the story finally came to light. This is still a source almost all writers cite when talking about the Pinto's deadly design, by the way. This article went on to win a Pulitzer Prize and forever changed the timeline for how the world viewed the Pinto. This piece was instrumental in making buyers much more safety conscious around cars, and has been credited with having huge influence on the automotive industry, even today. After he studied hundreds of reports and documents on rear-end Pinto collisions, he found that a crash at just 30 miles per hour could cause the car to completely squash right up to the back seat. Since the petrol tank is situated between the rear bumper and the back seat, it probably won't surprise you that a crash like this would almost certainly cause a load of petrol to spill out onto the road. Worse still is that they found at 40 miles an hour, there's a pretty good chance the doors would jam, making escape near impossible for the passengers, since just a single spark could set the car alight in seconds. Trapped passengers would almost certainly burn. As I said earlier, Ford knew this was an issue. Every single crash test Ford had performed at over 25 miles per hour resulted in a busted fuel tank. Ford officials lied about this knowledge in court, claiming they had no idea. Not only this, but they even did crash tests with some minor alterations which didn't get ruptured fuel tanks. They came up with 3 potential solutions. All of them were inexpensive and easily helped to prevent this deadly flaw from taking so many lives. Firstly, they put a piece of plastic between the petrol tank and differential housing. In another test, they put a bit of metal between the bumper and the tank, which also worked. And finally, they also tried lining the petrol tank with rubber. All of these solutions were cheap, easy to add, and wouldn't add much weight to the car at all. But Ford decided not to go ahead with any of them during mass production. One of the suitable fixes, the plastic one, would have cost around $11 per car to implement. The Pinto was being sold initially for $150 below their goal of a $2,000 car, so this could easily have been fit into the budget. Partly why this happened can be put down to the challenging time window in which the car was developed. Whilst a normal development window at the time on a new model was around 43 months, the Pinto's was crammed into less than 25. The way they did this was by working on multiple elements at the same time. They were working on the assembly line before the other processes were even close to finished. How close to finished? Well, reportedly the tooling was being done at the same time as product development. Again, thank you to Mother Jones for compiling this information. A man by the name of Lee Iacocca was responsible for heading the development of the Pinto. He'd earned a reputation for himself as being an astute businessman in the automotive industry, thanks to his lead role in developing the Ford Mustang. The Pinto was his brainchild. He wanted a car which could compete head-to-head with the Japanese imports, which were beginning to take over the subcompact market. It seems like Lee was in somewhat of a panic, and this knee-jerk reaction is why development speed was such an essential element in this project. Now, to credit Lee, his vision for the $2,000 subcompact clearly struck a nerve as the model became a bestseller. How much he knew about how deadly the car was, we don't really know, but an insider claimed that no one told Lee about this huge flaw in the design because they would have been fired on the spot. So what happened after all this? Hundreds of deaths, deceit, lobbying and corner cutting eventually led to Ford voluntarily performing a recall between 1971 and 76. They fixed the cars by implementing a longer petrol tank filler neck and also that $11 piece of plastic we mentioned earlier. Additionally, there were a ton of lawsuits thrown at Ford, which will come as no surprise. The Grimshaw versus Ford lawsuit ended with Ford being ordered to pay over $125 million worth of damages as a result of the death of Lily Gray and several third-degree burns to Richard Grimshaw, who was a passenger. At the time, this lawsuit was the third largest personal injury or product liability award in US history. A judge did actually reduce their liability though to just $3.5 million. The tragedy of hundreds of people burning to death can't be undermined by this next bit, but I do think it's important to cover. Weirdly, there was a bit of a U-turn in the Pinto's history. After the fiery outrage of the public started to burn out, a study by a UCLA professor in 1990 found that the Pinto in reality was no more dangerous than its other competitors at the time. A study by the NHTSA discovers the Pinto had around 298 deaths per million cars in 1975, which was less than the Toyota Corolla and VW Beetle. So, is the Pinto really the most dangerous car of all time then? No, but it's definitely a story of what happens when a business cut corners when it comes to the safety of their customers. Since this video is meant to be about the most dangerous car of all time, I don't want to leave you empty-handed after all that. So let's take one last look at which car is actually the most dangerous. The most dangerous car in the US statistically is the Chevy Silverado, with 8,777 fatalities between 2016 and 2020. This is partly due to its popularity though, rather than being inherently more dangerous than all other cars on the road. It's like how the Ford Fiesta is one of the most commonly stolen cars in the UK, but mainly just because it's one of the most popular models too. And with that, thank you so much for watching. I just want to quickly mention, I really appreciate all of the nice comments and support on the last video I did, the Autobahn crash. So go and check that out if you haven't yet. Thanks for watching.